They were told cowboys were rough, cruel men who showed no mercy to enemies. But when 73 exhausted German women stumbled off the transport truck in rural Texas, September 1945, the ranchers broke them not with whips or chains, but with something far more dangerous: kindness. They expected cramped barracks and guard towers. Instead, they got real beds inside a ranch house that smelled like home-cooked meals. The women stood frozen in the dusty driveway, their eyes wide with disbelief. Behind them stretched miles of open Texas plains, golden in the fading sunlight. Before them stood a sprawling wooden ranch house with a wide porch and rocking chairs. One woman whispered to another in German, "This cannot be real. This must be a trick." But it was real. And what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the enemy. If stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold history from World War II. The journey to Texas had been long and confusing. These women had spent the final months of the war working as auxiliaries for the Wehrmacht. They were nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, and field assistants. When Germany fell in May 1945, they found themselves prisoners of the Allied forces. Most expected to be sent to crowded detention camps in Europe. Instead, they were loaded onto ships bound for America. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. The women huddled in the ship's holds, seasick and scared, wondering what fate awaited them. America was supposed to be the land of their enemies, a nation that had bombed their cities and destroyed their homeland. What mercy could they expect there? After landing in New York, they traveled by train for days, watching the American landscape roll past the windows. Cities gave way to farmland, farmland to desert, and finally they reached the flat, endless plains of West Texas. The heat hit them like a wall when the train doors opened. This was September, but Texas heat showed no mercy. They were loaded onto military trucks with canvas covers. The vehicles bounced along dirt roads for what felt like hours. Through gaps in the canvas, the women caught glimpses of cattle ranches, windmills spinning lazily in the breeze, and vast fields of nothing but grass and sky. Some of the younger women had never seen such open space. Others, farm girls from Bavaria or Prussia, felt a strange recognition in the landscape. When the trucks finally stopped, the women climbed down stiffly. Their gray work uniforms were wrinkled and stained with sweat. Their hair hung limp and unwashed. Most hadn't seen a proper bed or hot shower in weeks. They expected barbed wire fences, guard towers, and armed soldiers watching their every move. What they saw instead stopped them in their tracks. A large ranch house stood before them, weathered wood painted white with dark green shutters. A wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with rocking chairs and hanging flower baskets. Behind the main house, they could see a barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses stood swishing their tails at flies. Chickens pecked in the yard. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. But what hit them first, what made several women gasp aloud, was the smell. Bread, fresh-baked bread, and something else. Meat cooking, onions frying, coffee brewing. The scent drifted from the open windows of the ranch house and wrapped around them like an invisible embrace. For women who had survived on thin soup and stale bread for months, the smell was almost painful in its intensity. One woman, Greta, a former nurse from Hamburg, felt tears spring to her eyes. She hadn't cried when her hospital was bombed. She hadn't cried when she was taken prisoner. But the smell of real food, the kind her mother used to make, broke something inside her. American soldiers stood nearby, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. But they weren't pointing guns or shouting orders. One was actually smiling. Another leaned against the porch railing, chewing tobacco and watching the women with mild curiosity. The scene felt wrong, too normal, too calm for what the women had been prepared for. And then the cowboys appeared. 3 men emerged from the ranch house. They wore dusty jeans, worn boots, and wide-brimmed hats that shaded their faces from the Texas sun. These weren't soldiers. These were ranchers, working men with weathered skin and calloused hands. The tallest one, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a thick mustache, stepped forward. He removed his hat, revealing a head of sweat-dampened hair, and nodded to the women. "Welcome to the Double R Ranch," he said in English. His voice was deep and gentle. "I'm Mr. Richardson. This here's my property, and you ladies are going to be staying with us for a while." An interpreter, a young German-American soldier, translated his words. The women stood in stunned silence. Staying here? At a ranch house? This made no sense. Prisoners were supposed to go to camps, not ranch homes. Mr. Richardson's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Barracks?" "Ma'am, we don't have barracks. You'll sleep in the guest rooms and the bunkhouse. We've got beds set up. Nothing fancy, but better than sleeping on the ground." Beds. Real beds. The women looked at each other, confusion and hope warring on their faces. This couldn't be right. Prisoners didn't get beds in houses. They got hard bunks in cold barracks if they were lucky. "Come on then," Mr. Richardson said, gesturing toward the house. "Let's get you settled. The day's too hot to be standing out here in the sun." Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to move. They climbed the porch steps, their worn boots echoing on the wooden planks. The front door stood open, and as they filed inside, the full force of the cooking smells hit them. Several women had to steady themselves against the wall. Inside, the ranch house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the blazing Texas heat. Wooden floors gleamed with polish. Photographs hung on the walls, showing family members and prize cattle. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, and through a doorway they could see a kitchen where a middle-aged woman in an apron stirred something in a large pot on the stove. Mrs. Richardson looked up as the women entered. She smiled warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, you poor dears," she said in English, her voice full of genuine sympathy. "You look absolutely exhausted. Come in, we'll get you cleaned up and fed." The kindness in her voice was unmistakable, even to those who didn't speak English. And that kindness, that genuine warmth, was more frightening than any guard's shout or rifle pointed in their direction. Because kindness meant hope. And hope, these women had learned, was the most dangerous thing of all. The women were divided into small groups. Mr. Richardson's two sons, both in their 20s, helped guide them to different parts of the property. The main house could hold about 15 women. The rest would stay in a large bunkhouse that had been hastily converted from what used to be storage for ranch equipment. But before anyone could settle in, there was the matter of washing. Mrs. Richardson, with help from her daughter Sarah, a practical woman in her early 30s, had prepared several washing stations. They showed the women to a converted storage room where large metal tubs had been filled with heated water. Clean towels were stacked on wooden benches. Bars of soap, real soap that smelled like lavender, waited next to each tub. The women stared at the setup in disbelief. Hot water, clean towels, soap that smelled like flowers. After months of cold water rationing and no soap at all, this felt like a dream. Greta was in the first group. She undressed slowly, her hands shaking. When she lowered herself into the warm water, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The heat sank into her aching muscles, washing away not just dirt, but months of exhaustion. She picked up the bar of soap, turned it over in her hands, and brought it to her nose. Lavender. Such a simple thing. Such a luxury. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. One woman, a tough former anti-aircraft spotter named Katrin, actually started crying silently as she scrubbed years of grime from her skin. Another, a young typist named Frida, kept whispering, thank you," in German, though no one was there to hear. After washing, they were given clean clothes. Not uniforms, but simple cotton dresses and work shirts that Mrs. Richardson and Sarah had collected from neighbors. The fabric was soft and smelled like sunshine from hanging on clotheslines. Most of the women hadn't worn civilian clothes in over a year. Anna, the young woman who had stared at the rocking chairs, put on a light blue dress that was slightly too big for her thin frame. She caught sight of herself in a small mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Clean. That's what she looked like. Clean and almost human again. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, the women were called to supper. The dining room couldn't fit everyone, so tables had been set up on the wide porch and in the yard. The setup was casual, almost like a church picnic. Cowboys from the ranch sat alongside American soldiers assigned to guard duty, and scattered among them were the German women, clean for the first time in months, nervously taking their seats. Mrs. Richardson and Sarah, along with two ranch hands' wives who had come to help, began bringing out the food. And what food it was. Large bowls of mashed potatoes, smooth and buttery, platters of roasted chicken, the skin golden and crispy, fresh green beans cooked with bacon, corn on the cob dripping with butter, biscuits so fluffy they seemed to float, gravy, real gravy, thick and rich, and for dessert, apple pie with a flaky crust that released the smell of cinnamon when cut. The women sat frozen, staring at the feast before them. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate setup. One meal before the real punishment began. Mr. Richardson stood and cleared his throat. The interpreter translated as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know this is an unusual situation for everyone. These women are our prisoners, yes, but they're also guests on my property. As long as you're here, you'll be treated with dignity and respect. That's how we do things on the Double R Ranch. Now let's say grace, and then everyone dig in." He bowed his head, and the cowboys followed suit. The German women, unsure what to do, did the same. Mr. Richardson said a simple prayer in English, thanking God for the food and asking for peace for all those at the table. When he finished, he looked up and smiled. "All right then. Let's eat." At first, no one moved. Then slowly, hesitantly, hands reached for food. Greta spooned mashed potatoes onto her plate. The potatoes were hot, creamy, seasoned perfectly with butter and salt. She took a small bite, and her eyes closed. It was the most delicious thing she'd tasted in years. Around the table, similar scenes played out. Women who had steeled themselves against emotion found tears rolling down their cheeks as they bit into warm, fresh bread. Katrin, the tough anti-aircraft spotter, covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly into her chicken. Anna ate slowly, methodically, as if afraid the food would disappear if she went too fast. One of the younger cowboys, a lanky kid named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 19, watched the women with concern. He leaned over to the interpreter. "Are they okay? Why are some of them crying?" The interpreter, a thoughtful young man named David, replied quietly, "Most of these women haven't had a real meal in months, maybe longer. Back in Germany toward the end of the war, food was scarce. They ate watery soup, stale bread, whatever they could find. This," he gestured at the feast, "this is overwhelming for them." Tommy looked down at his own plate, suddenly uncomfortable. "Huh," he said softly. "I guess I never thought about it that way." As the meal continued, some of the tension began to ease. Cowboys started passing bowls of food directly to the women, encouraging them to take more. "Don't be shy now," one older ranch hand said through the interpreter. "There's plenty more where this came from." And there was. When the first bowls emptied, Mrs. Richardson brought out more. The women couldn't believe it. More food. Still more food. In Germany, toward the end, you were lucky to get one small portion. Here they were encouraged to take seconds, even thirds. Margaretti, the stern former administrator, ate slowly and deliberately, but even she couldn't hide the wonder in her eyes. She leaned over to Greta and whispered in German, "If this is captivity, what must freedom look like in this country?" Greta had no answer. She simply continued eating, trying to memorize the taste of real butter, real meat, real food. After supper, when the sun had fully set and the Texas stars blazed overhead in a sky unpolluted by city lights, the women were shown to their sleeping quarters. Those assigned to the main house were led upstairs by Mrs. Richardson and Sarah. The guest rooms were simple but clean. Each room had 2 or 3 beds with real mattresses, not just wooden boards or straw sacks, clean white sheets, pillows with cotton cases, wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed, a nightstand with an oil lamp, a window with curtains that stirred in the evening breeze. Greta and Liesel were assigned to share a room. They stood in the doorway, neither quite able to step inside. It felt like trespassing, like they were sneaking into someone else's life. "Go on," Mrs. Richardson said gently through the interpreter. "These beds are for you. Get some rest. You look like you need it." When Mrs. Richardson left, Greta and Liesel entered slowly. Greta sat on the edge of one bed and pressed down gently on the mattress. It gave slightly, soft, and supportive. She lay back, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. A real bed. With a real mattress, and sheets that smelled like soap and sunshine. Liesel sat on the other bed, her hands folded in her lap. She was shaking. "Greta," she whispered in German, "what is happening? Why are they treating us like this?" Greta didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The same question had been echoing in her own mind since the moment they arrived. Finally, she said, "I don't know, but I'm too tired to figure it out tonight. Let's just sleep. We can think about it tomorrow." But sleep didn't come easily for most of the women that night. Those in the bunkhouse found themselves in similar accommodations, simple beds with clean linens, far better than they'd expected. Some lay awake, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Others cried quietly into their pillows, overwhelmed by emotions they couldn't name. Anna, sharing a small room in the main house with 2 other young women, kept getting up to touch the curtains, the nightstand, the soft blanket. She needed to confirm it was all real. When she finally did fall asleep, she dreamed of her grandmother's house, the smell of baking bread, and rocking chairs on a porch that looked just like this one. Outside, one of the cowboys on night watch leaned against the barn and looked up at the lighted windows of the ranch house. He'd been skeptical when Mr. Richardson announced they'd be housing German POWs. But seeing those exhausted women at dinner, watching them cry over simple food, had changed something in his perspective. These weren't monsters. They were just tired, scared people a long way from home. The Texas night settled over the Double R Ranch, peaceful and quiet. Inside the house, 73 German women slowly began to let go of the tension they'd carried for months. Not completely, not yet, but enough to close their eyes and, for the first time in a very long time, sleep deeply. Morning came early on a working ranch. The roosters crowed just before dawn, and the women woke to sunlight streaming through their windows. For a few disoriented seconds, each woman forgot where she was. Then memory returned. Texas. A ranch. The enemy's land. But the morning brought new surprises. Breakfast was served at 6:30, and once again the food was generous. Eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, fresh coffee, milk from the ranch's own dairy cows. The women ate more cautiously now, no longer crying, but still marveling at the plenty. After breakfast, Mr. Richardson explained through the interpreter how things would work. The women were prisoners of war, yes, and they couldn't leave the ranch property, but within those boundaries they had freedom to move around. They would be assigned work duties, light labor around the ranch. In exchange, they'd continue to receive room, board, and a small wage. The work assignments were posted on the kitchen wall. Some women were assigned to help in the kitchen, preparing meals alongside Mrs. Richardson and Sarah. Others would work in the vegetable garden, tend the chickens, help with laundry, and assist with mending and repairs. A few with medical training, like Greta, were asked to help in the ranch's small clinic treating minor injuries among the ranch hands. The work was real but not backbreaking. No one was pushed beyond their limits. When the midday sun grew too intense, everyone took a break in the shade. Water was always available. If someone felt sick or exhausted, they were told to rest. No questions asked. This pattern of work and rest felt foreign to women who had come from a military system where rest was seen as weakness. Here, one of the ranch hands, an older man named Joe, actually scolded a woman for trying to work through her obvious exhaustion. "Young lady," he said through the interpreter, "sitting down when you're tired ain't laziness. It's good sense. Now go rest in the shade before you fall over." Evenings brought communal dinners, similar to that first night. The food never stopped being abundant. Cowboys and prisoners ate side by side, slowly growing accustomed to each other's presence. Some of the younger ranch hands even started trying to learn basic German phrases. "Guten Morgen," Tommy would say with an exaggerated accent, grinning when the women corrected his pronunciation. After dinner, the women had free time. Some wrote letters home, carefully worded messages that would be read by censors. Others sat on the porch, rocking slowly in those chairs that had caught Anna's attention on the first day. A few even started helping Sarah with her knitting, sharing patterns and techniques despite the language barrier. Sundays were days of rest. Mr. Richardson and his family attended the local church, but the German women were not required to go. Instead, they spent quiet days reading, talking, or simply enjoying the peace of the ranch. Some of the women who were religious held their own services, singing hymns in German while seated under the shade of a large oak tree. As the days turned into weeks, the contrast between their current situation and what they had left behind grew increasingly sharp and painful. Letters from home began to arrive, heavily censored and often months old. They painted a picture of devastation. Greta received a letter from her sister describing how their family home in Hamburg had been destroyed in a bombing raid. They now lived in the basement of a partially collapsed building, sharing space with 3 other families. Food was scarce. Her sister's children were thin and constantly sick. That night, Greta sat at the dinner table, staring at her plate piled high with pot roast, vegetables, and fresh bread. Her sister's children were starving in a bombed-out basement. She was eating better than she had in her entire life. The guilt was crushing. She wasn't alone in this feeling. Margaret received news that her husband, a low-ranking Wehrmacht officer, was in a Soviet prison camp. The conditions there, according to rumors that filtered through, were brutal. Men died daily from disease and starvation. Meanwhile, she slept on a comfortable mattress and woke to fresh eggs for breakfast. Liesel's letter brought news that her parents' shop in Berlin had been looted and burned. They had nothing left. Her mother ended the letter with a plea. "If you have anything, any food at all, please try to send it." But Liesel couldn't send food. She could only send words, hollow and useless. The women began to understand the full scope of American abundance. This ranch wasn't even particularly wealthy. It was a working cattle ranch, modest by Texas standards. Yet the food never ran out. The Richardson family never seemed worried about their next meal. The pantry stayed stocked. The cows gave milk daily. The chickens laid eggs. The garden produced vegetables. There was always more. One afternoon, Anna was helping Sarah preserve vegetables in the kitchen. Jars and jars of tomatoes, beans, and pickles lined the shelves. Anna, overwhelmed, asked through the interpreter, "Why so much? How can you possibly use all of this?" Sarah looked confused by the question. "This is just our normal preserving. We do it every year to get through the winter. Don't you can vegetables in Germany?" Anna tried to explain. "We did. Before the war. But in the last few years there was no food to preserve. We ate what we could find, when we could find it. Seeing all this..." She gestured at the jars. "It's hard to believe it's real." Sarah's face softened with understanding and pity. She placed a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine what that must have been like. But you're safe here now. There's plenty of food. You don't have to worry about that anymore." But Anna did worry. How could she not? While she stood in this abundant kitchen, her family back home was struggling to survive. The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. Despite the language barrier and the strange circumstances, small moments of genuine human connection began to emerge. One evening, Katrin, the former anti-aircraft spotter, was helping fix a fence with Joe, the older ranch hand. They worked in companionable silence, communicating mostly through gestures and nods. When they finished, Joe pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Katrin. She accepted with surprise and gratitude. They stood there, watching the sun set over the plains, smoking together without a word. It was Joe who finally broke the silence. "You know," he said, knowing she probably couldn't understand but talking anyway, "my boy fought in France. He made it home, thank God. But I wonder, did he ever stand like this with one of your soldiers? Just 2 people taking a break, sharing a smoke?" He paused. "I'd like to think so. I'd like to think even in war, there are moments when we remember we're all just human." Katrin didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded slowly and said in German, "My brother died on the Eastern Front. I hope, in his last days, someone showed him kindness." Joe couldn't understand her either, but he seemed to sense the meaning. He nodded back, and they finished their cigarettes in peaceful silence. Tommy, the young cowboy, developed an unlikely friendship with Frida, one of the younger German women. He taught her English words, pointing at objects and saying their names slowly. Horse, sky, star, friend. She taught him German in return. Their lessons became a nightly ritual on the porch, much to the amusement of both cowboys and prisoners. One night Tommy brought out his harmonica and played a few folk tunes. The music was simple but beautiful. When he finished, Frida began to sing a German folk song her mother had taught her. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying across the quiet ranch. Other women joined in, their voices blending in harmony. The cowboys listened in respectful silence. When the song ended, Mr. Richardson, who had been sitting quietly in his rocking chair, said softly, "That was beautiful. Music is the same in any language." Mrs. Richardson took a special interest in the women's health. She noticed that many were too thin, with brittle hair and pale skin showing signs of malnutrition. She began making sure they got extra portions at meals, brought them vitamin-rich vegetables from the garden, and even convinced the ranch doctor to check on them regularly. When Greta mentioned she'd been a nurse, Mrs. Richardson's eyes lit up. She took Greta to the ranch's medical supplies and asked her to check the inventory, make sure everything was organized properly. It was make work, really, since everything was already well organized. But Mrs. Richardson understood that Greta needed to feel useful, needed to use her skills. That simple act of respect, of recognizing Greta's expertise, meant more than any amount of food. These small moments accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a bucket. Each kind word, each shared cigarette, each music-filled evening added to a growing realization that was becoming harder and harder to deny. By the third week, the internal conflict had become unbearable for many of the women. Late at night, after the lamps were extinguished and the ranch settled into quiet darkness, they would lie awake, wrestling with thoughts that challenged everything they'd been taught. Greta had always considered herself a patriotic German. She'd joined the medical corps because she believed in serving her country. The propaganda had taught her that Americans were crude, violent people who valued nothing but money and power. They were supposed to be the enemy, the destroyers of European civilization. But the people she'd met on this ranch didn't match that description at all. Mr. Richardson was thoughtful and fair. Mrs. Richardson was genuinely kind, not in a showy way, but in small, consistent acts of care. The cowboys worked hard and treated everyone, including the prisoners, with basic respect. Even the young soldiers assigned to guard duty were polite and often friendly. One night, unable to sleep, Greta sat by the window and looked out at the star-filled Texas sky. She thought about her sister's children, starving in Hamburg. She thought about the meal she'd eaten that evening, pot roast with all the trimmings. And she thought about the fundamental question that was tearing her apart. How could the enemy show more care for her well-being than her own government had? The uncomfortable truth was that in the final years of the war, the German military leadership had treated its own people as expendable. Food went to the front lines while civilians starved. Buildings were left unheated to save fuel for tanks. Medical supplies disappeared into the chaos of retreat while nurses like Greta worked with almost nothing. Here in this enemy land, she had everything she'd lacked at home: food, shelter, safety, medical supplies, respect. The realization felt like betrayal. But betrayal of what? Of whom? Her country had sent her into war and then abandoned her to captivity. These strangers, these supposed enemies, were the ones actually taking care of her. Anna struggled with similar thoughts. She'd been young when the war started, barely 13. She'd grown up with propaganda, with the constant message that Germany was superior, that other nations were inferior. She'd believed it because everyone around her believed it, and what else was a child supposed to do? But living on the Double R Ranch was forcing her to confront the possibility that she'd been lied to. Not about small things, but about everything. About who the enemy was. About what mattered in life. About what real strength looked like. These cowboys, with their casual manners and simple lives, were stronger than any of the officers she'd known. They built things instead of destroying them. They created abundance instead of hoarding scarcity. They showed mercy not because they were weak, but because they were secure enough to be generous. The women began to talk among themselves more openly, carefully testing whether others shared their doubts and confusion. These conversations usually happened late at night, in whispers, with an unspoken agreement that what was said in darkness wouldn't be repeated in daylight. Margaret, the stern former administrator, was slower to change than most. She clung to her old beliefs with fierce determination. "They're treating us well because it makes them look good," she argued one night when several women gathered in her room. "Don't be fooled. This is all for propaganda purposes." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. If this was just propaganda, why do it in the middle of nowhere? On a private ranch where no one would see? Why go to such effort for 73 women who had no power, no importance, no value as propaganda tools? Liesel pushed back gently. But if it's propaganda, who are they performing for? There are no cameras here, no reporters. Just us and these ranch people who seem to be doing this because... She paused, struggling with the words. Because they think it's the right thing to do. The room fell silent. That was the hardest pill to swallow, the most challenging idea to accept. That maybe, just maybe, these Americans were being kind simply because they believed treating prisoners with dignity was the right thing to do. Not for propaganda, not for show. Just because different women processed this realization in different ways. Some, like Katrin, accepted it quickly and began to embrace the change. She started learning English with real enthusiasm, making friends among the ranch hands, laughing freely for the first time in years. Others, like Margaret, resisted. She remained polite but distant, doing her assigned work efficiently but refusing to engage in casual conversation. Her resistance was fear, though she'd never admit it. If she accepted that the Americans were genuinely good people, then what did that say about the cause she'd served? What did it say about all the sacrifices made? A few women fell somewhere in between, confused and uncertain. Frida summed up this middle ground one evening when she said, "I don't know what to think anymore. I don't know what's true. I just know I'm grateful to be alive and safe." The generational divide became apparent too. Younger women like Anna and Frida adapted more easily. They were flexible, still forming their worldview, able to incorporate new information. Older women who had spent decades believing one narrative found change much harder. One Sunday afternoon, about 6 weeks into their stay, a moment occurred that crystallized the transformation many women were experiencing. Mr. Richardson had invited all the women to gather in the shade of the large oak tree. Through the interpreter, he explained that he wanted to talk to them about something important. "I know you ladies have been through a lot," he began. "War is terrible, and it leaves scars on everyone it touches, winners and losers alike." He paused, removing his hat and turning it slowly in his weathered hands. "My son fought in Europe. He came home, thank God, but he came home changed. He saw things no young man should have to see. Did things no young man should have to do." The women listened intently. Even those who couldn't understand English well could feel the weight of his words. "When they told me I'd be housing German POWs, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure how I'd feel about it. But then you arrived, and I saw how tired you were, how scared, how young some of you are." He looked around at their faces. "And I realized something important. The war's over. It's done. Holding on to anger and hatred won't bring back the dead or rebuild what was destroyed. But treating each other with decency, that's how we start healing. That's how we move forward." He put his hat back on. "So that's why we're treating you the way we are. Not because we've forgotten what country you're from or what happened in the war, but because you're people, and people deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. That's all." As the interpreter finished translating, silence settled over the group. Then quietly, almost imperceptibly, several women began to cry. Not the overwhelmed tears of that first meal, but something deeper. Tears of recognition, of relief, of letting go. Greta understood in that moment what had been changing inside her for weeks. This wasn't about choosing sides or betraying her homeland. It was about recognizing a fundamental truth that transcended nations and armies. People could choose kindness even when they had every reason to choose cruelty. Dignity didn't have to be earned. It could simply be given. The German military had demanded absolute loyalty and given back suffering. The American ranchers asked for nothing and gave freely. The contrast wasn't just about food or beds, it was about the very definition of strength. Real strength, Greta realized, wasn't about domination or conquest. It was about having the power to hurt someone and choosing not to. It was about abundance shared rather than hoarded. It was about seeing humanity in your enemy. That evening, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, the women's conversations were more about the future than the past. They talked about what they would do when they returned home, how they would rebuild, what they would tell their children and grandchildren about this strange, transformative time. Anna sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope that things would go back to how they were before the war. That was impossible. But hope that something new and better could be built from the ruins. The moment of true revelation came during a crisis that no one expected. 8 weeks into their stay, one of the younger women, a timid girl named Elsa, fell seriously ill with appendicitis. The pain came on suddenly one evening after dinner. Within hours, she was feverish and delirious, clutching her abdomen and crying out. Greta examined her and immediately knew the severity. "It's her appendix," she told Mrs. Richardson through the interpreter. "She needs surgery, soon, or she'll die." The nearest hospital was 40 miles away in town. Mr. Richardson didn't hesitate. "Get her in the truck. I'll drive." He turned to his son. "Jack, you come with me in case we need to explain the situation to the MPs." But Greta stepped forward. "I should go with her. I'm a nurse. I can monitor her condition during the drive." Mr. Richardson looked at the military officer present, seeking approval. The officer hesitated. Allowing a POW to leave the ranch violated protocols, but looking at Elsa, clearly in agony and declining fast, he made a decision. Go, but you, he pointed at another soldier, ride with them. The ride to town was harrowing. Elsa drifted in and out of consciousness. Greta sat beside her, holding her hand and monitoring her pulse. Mr. Richardson drove faster than was probably safe on the rough roads, his jaw set with determination. At one point, when Elsa seemed to stabilize slightly, Mr. Richardson glanced back at Greta. You're good at this. Being a nurse, I mean. You must have saved a lot of lives during the war. Greta's response was quiet. I tried, but toward the end we had so few supplies, so few medicines. I watched people die who shouldn't have died just because we had nothing to treat them with. Mr. Richardson nodded slowly. War is a terrible thing. Terrible. They reached the hospital just in time. Elsa was rushed into emergency surgery. Greta, Mr. Richardson, Jack, and the soldier sat in the waiting room as the hours crawled by. Around 2 a.m, the surgeon emerged, tired but smiling. She's going to be fine. We got the appendix before it ruptured. She's a lucky young lady. The relief that flooded through Greta was overwhelming. She sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how terrified she'd been. This girl, this German prisoner, had just been saved by American doctors in an American hospital. Saved without question, without hesitation, as if her life had value equal to any American life. Mr. Richardson walked over and placed a gentle hand on Greta's shoulder. You did good work keeping her stable during the drive. Real good work. Greta looked up at him, this Texas rancher who had driven through the night to save the life of an enemy prisoner. Why? She asked in halting English. Why you do this? Mr. Richardson seemed puzzled by the question. Why? Because she needed help. Because she's a person. What other reason would I need? And there it was. The full weight of understanding crashed over Greta like a wave. To Mr. Richardson, to Mrs. Richardson, to the cowboys and the soldiers who had become their unexpected guardians, the women's nationality didn't matter. Their past didn't matter. What mattered was their humanity. This wasn't strategy. It wasn't propaganda. It wasn't even particularly philosophical. It was simply how these people lived their lives. They saw people in need and they helped. It was that simple and that profound. On the drive back to the ranch with Elsa resting safely in the hospital, Greta sat in the truck and watched the Texas landscape slip past in the pre-dawn darkness. She thought about everything she'd believed, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd lost, and she realized that the most powerful force in the world wasn't military might or political ideology. It was simple human decency, the willingness to see the person before the uniform, the courage to choose compassion over cruelty. The Germany she'd known had valued strength and order above all else. It had created a system where some lives were valued more than others, where showing weakness was dangerous, where mercy was seen as failure. But here, in this strange American ranch in the middle of nowhere, she'd learned that real strength meant having the power to be cruel and choosing kindness instead. Real order came from people freely cooperating because they respected each other, not from fear and force. Real value came from recognizing the worth in every human life. When they arrived back at the ranch, the sun was just rising. The other women crowded around asking about Elsa. When Greta told them she would survive, relief and joy spread through the group. Even Margaret, stern Margaret, who had resisted change so stubbornly, had tears in her eyes. That morning, something shifted. The last walls of resistance crumbled. The women were no longer just surviving captivity. They were living, learning, changing. And for many, that change would last the rest of their lives. As autumn arrived in Texas, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the promise of winter, word came that repatriation would begin soon. The women would be returned to Germany, back to their families and their devastated homeland. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions. Excitement at the prospect of seeing family again, fear of what they would find when they returned, and for many, an unexpected sadness at leaving the Double R Ranch. Anna sat with Frida one evening, both of them unusually quiet. Finally, Frida voiced what they were both thinking. I'm afraid to go back. Is that terrible? I should want to go home. But part of me wants to stay here, where there's food and safety and... She struggled for the words. Where people are kind. Anna understood completely. She felt the same conflict. Home meant her family, her language, her culture. But home also meant ruins, hunger, and the ghosts of a terrible past. Here she'd glimpsed a different way of living. A way based on abundance rather than scarcity, on cooperation rather than domination, on hope rather than fear. Could she carry that vision back with her? Could she help build something new from the ashes of the old? The women began preparing for departure in small ways. They mended their old uniforms, which had been carefully stored when they arrived. They wrote letters to family trying to prepare them for their return without revealing too much about their experiences. The censors would read everything, and some things were too personal, too transformative to put into words anyway. Greta spent her final days helping Mrs. Richardson in the kitchen, learning recipes she could take back with her. Mrs. Richardson carefully wrote down instructions, translating them into German with the help of the interpreter. "These are simple meals," she said, "but they're filling and nutritious. If you can get the ingredients, you can feed people well." On their last Sunday, Mr. Richardson organized a farewell dinner. It was more elaborate than usual, almost festive. The ranch hands came dressed in their best clothes. The women wore the nicest dresses they'd been given. Tables were set up in the yard under strings of lights, creating a warm, magical atmosphere as night fell. During the dinner, Mr. Richardson stood to speak. The familiar process of interpretation followed, his words translated into German for all to understand. "Ladies POW, he began. "When you first arrived here, I'll admit I wasn't sure how this would work out. Housing former enemy soldiers, even women, seemed like it might be difficult. But you've proven me wrong in the best way possible. You've worked hard, you've been respectful, and you've reminded all of us that beneath the uniforms and the national flags, we're all just people trying to make our way in this world." He paused, his weathered face thoughtful. "You're going back to a hard situation. Your country has been through hell. Rebuilding will take years, maybe decades. It won't be easy." He looked around at their faces. "But I've seen your strength. I've seen your resilience. You've survived war and loss and captivity. You'll survive this too. And more than survive, you'll rebuild. You'll create something new and better." Mrs. Richardson spoke next, her voice warm. "We want you to take something with you. Not just the clothes and small items we've given you, but something more important. Remember that kindness is never weakness. Remember that taking care of each other isn't foolish. It's the foundation of a good society. Remember that former enemies can become friends. Take these memories, these lessons, and use them to build a better future." Several women were crying openly now. Even Margaret had tears streaming down her face. Tommy pulled out his harmonica and played a slow, beautiful melody. Frida stood and began to sing, a German song about home and hope. Her voice carried across the ranch, and one by one other women joined in. When the song ended, something unexpected happened. The Cowboys stood and applauded. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it felt like everything the past 3 months had been about. Recognition, respect, shared humanity. The next morning the trucks arrived to take them away. The women gathered their few belongings. Many had gained weight during their stay. Their faces were fuller, their eyes clearer. They looked healthy, rested, stronger than when they arrived. As they prepared to board the trucks, each woman made a point of saying goodbye to the Richardson family and the ranch hands. Some shook hands formally. Others, like Anna, hugged Mrs. Richardson tightly, whispering "Danke" over and over. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Greta was the last aboard. She turned back one final time to look at the ranch house with its wide porch and rocking chairs. Mr. Richardson stood there, hat in hand. They exchanged a long look, a moment of understanding that needed no words. Then she climbed into the truck and it pulled away. The women watched through the back as the Double R Ranch grew smaller and smaller, finally disappearing in a cloud of dust. The journey back to Germany was long. The women traveled by truck, train, and ship, retracing the route that had brought them to Texas. But they were not the same women who had made that journey 3 months earlier. They arrived in Germany to find exactly what they'd feared: a country in ruins. Cities were skeletal remains of their former selves. People looked gaunt and worn. Resources were scarce. The task of rebuilding seemed overwhelming. But the women from the Double R Ranch approached the challenge differently than others might have. They'd seen what was possible when people worked together with generosity and respect. They'd experienced firsthand how treating people with dignity gave them strength and hope. Greta used her nursing skills to help her community, but she also used the lessons she'd learned about the importance of adequate food and rest. She fought for better conditions for her patients, argued with authorities who wanted to cut corners, and became known as a fierce advocate for basic human dignity. Anna, young and adaptable, threw herself into rebuilding efforts with an optimism that surprised others. When people asked where she got her hope, she would talk about a ranch in Texas where cowboys treated enemies like guests. Some people thought she was exaggerating or even making it up, but she knew the truth, and that truth sustained her through the hard years of Reconstruction. Even Margaret, who had resisted change so stubbornly, found herself transformed. She became involved in programs to help former soldiers reintegrate into civilian life, drawing on her own experience of captivity that had been marked by unexpected kindness rather than cruelty. Years later, when the women had families of their own, they would tell their children and grandchildren about those 3 months in Texas. Some details faded with time, but certain things remained vivid. The smell of fresh baked bread, the taste of real butter, the softness of clean sheets, the sound of Tommy's harmonica, the kindness in Mrs. Richardson's eyes, the dignity in Mr. Richardson's words, and always, always they would emphasize the lesson that had changed their lives. That real strength lies in choosing kindness, that former enemies can become friends, that how you treat people matters more than which flag they salute. And so the beds in the ranch house became more than just furniture. They became symbols of a different way of being in the world. For those 73 German women, the memory of sleeping safely in enemy territory, of being treated with dignity when they expected cruelty, of being given rest when they deserved nothing, became a touchstone they carried for the rest of their lives. The Cowboys of the Double R Ranch had shown them something profound, that you don't defeat your enemies by becoming like them. You defeat them by being better than them, by choosing mercy over vengeance, by seeing humans instead of soldiers, by offering beds instead of chains. As one of the women, Greta, told her granddaughter decades later, "In war, cruelty is easy. Anyone can be cruel. But kindness? Kindness when you have every reason to be cruel, that takes real strength. That's what I learned in Texas. And that's what I tried to teach you." The story of the Double R Ranch is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even between enemies, humanity can shine through. That the choice to be kind is always available to us. And that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is treat your enemy like a human being who deserves rest. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. These histories matter. They remind us of our shared humanity and show us that even in war, kindness can triumph. Thank you for listening, and remember, you deserve rest too.